Alright, we're going to start off talking about Spartans today. Last we left off, we were talking about just the city-states in general, known as the polises. We said that Sparta had the strongest army, and we said that both of them developed very differently, and that was kind of our cliffhanger. As I said, we're going to talk specifically about Sparta, and then on Monday we'll talk specifically about Athens. Before we do that, let's do some pronunciations. Look at the words on the left, and figure out which words on the right need to get matched up there. The first one is Periece. Weird spelling, lots of vowels in there. Next one is Helots. Next one is Ephors. And Peloponnesus. It's capitalized, proper noun. It's got to be a place. And aristocrats. 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 By the end of today, you'll know what those are. Let's go through them again. Periece, Helots, Ephors, Peloponnesus, and aristocrats. We'll use all of those. Here we go. Sparta. I know I'm going quickly, but this is just to review or to help you fill in your notes. Sparta was in southern Greece. It's an area called Peloponnesus. Sparta was in southern Greece. It's an area called Peloponnesus. Here we have a map you're used to. Let me zoom out a little bit for you. And if we look, let me switch over. And if we look, we have this area that we've referred to a lot as just the southern Greece. It is northwest of Crete. And that whole area is going to be called Peloponnesus. So that's where Sparta was located. Back to the notes. Sparta was in an area called Peloponnesus in southern Greece. They were the greatest military power in all of Greece. They were the greatest military power in all of Greece. They were very hardcore, and we'll go over that next week. Government. Let me tell you about the Sparta government. First of all, the king's power was taken over by aristocrats, or nobles. So aristocrat or nobles, we've seen the word nobles before when we were talking about different class systems. So aristocrats are pretty much just rich people. Kings were left to lead the army. So the king's power was taken away by the rich people. So the rich people, or the nobles, or the aristocrats, had the power. The kings were left to lead the army. That's why the armies were good. Only the aristocrats were Spartan citizens. Only aristocrats were Spartan citizens. Remember we talked about citizens yesterday and what they were. They were also part of a lawmaking group called the Assembly. And if you look in my classroom, you can see above the smartboard a picture of the Assembly. So that's a lawmaking group. 5 ephors were in charge of public affairs. So there were 5 people that were large and in charge. They were called ephors, and they were in charge of the assembly, in charge of public affairs, making sure all the systems of government worked well. Moving on. Life for Spartans. Spartans were too cool to farm. Cool with a K. Their land was worked by someone called a helot, which is an enslaved person. We've seen the word enslaved person before, and we know that in the middle of it, it has the word slave. So, land was worked by the helots. They were worked by enslaved people, which were owned by the city-state. The slaves were owned by the city-state. Next, helots had to give back half of their crops. Helots had to give back half of their crops. They did all the work, but they only got to keep half. Also, Spartans were too cool for business and trade. They were too cool for business and trade. This was done by a group of people called the Periece, which are merchants, and you know that merchants are people that sell stuff. Soon, there were 20 times more helots and Periece than there were rich people. So the aristocrats decided to have a beatdown to keep them all under control. So soon there were more middle class or lower class than there were upper class.
And Robert Fortner, could you please report to the office? Justin Mercer and Robert Fortner. Thank you.
Upper class then decided that they were going to beat down the lower class and keep them under control. Moving on. Spartans were obsessed with their strength. Spartans were obsessed with their strength. Their babies were examined as soon as they were born. If they were a weak baby, if they looked weak, if they looked like they couldn't be a Spartan warrior, they were sent off to the hills to die. They were sent off to the hills to die. Boys at age 7 were sent to military camps where they had to learn to read, they had to learn to write, and they had to learn to use weapons. Read, write, use weapons, all at age 7. Let me read to you from the book what happens on page 167. It tells about the life of Spartan boys. Top of 167. When Spartan boys turned 7, they were sent to live in military camps. There they were trained in groups under teenage leaders. They learned to read and write and use weapons. The boys received only small amounts of food. They had to go barefoot, and they were given only one cloak to wear. They walked in silence with their eyes to the ground and spoke only when necessary. They slept outdoors and without cover. Every 10 days they were lined up and examined to make sure that they were not getting fat. Spartan men were not expected to marry were expected to marry at 20 years of age. However, they could not have a household of their own. They had to live and eat in military barracks, where they shared expenses with other soldiers. They could retire from the army when they were 60 years old. Spartan women, on the other hand, had more freedom than the women of other Greek city-states. In other Greek city-states, women spent most of their time at home performing household duties. They could not go out without a chaperone. Then they could only visit other women and attend religious festivals. They never spoke to men in the street or entertained their husbands' friends. Spartan women, on the other hand, mixed freely with men. They enjoyed sports such as wrestling and racing. When Spartan women sent their men into battle, they told their men to come home with their shields or on them. If the men brought their shields home with them, that meant that they had won. Dead warriors were carried home on their shields. So that's a little bit about Sparta.